While looking for clues in the Consolidation Coal Company scandal series, we found in the Mountain Eagle newspaper the story of Dolph Hall. The newspaper article was very short, but it piqued our interest, and so for the past couple of months, we have been researching this particular case. As with all stories in the Appalachian Mountains, things are not always what they seem at first. There are no public pictures of the people who were spoken of in this story. So we have placed known pictures of Letcher County Court House, the Kentucky Appellate Court, and general pictures to help us tell this story. All aboard the Kentucky Tennessee Living Time Machine as we depart on a new series about Troy Triplett and Dolph Hall. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up that time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine for our flight back in time, but it convinces the YouTube algorithm that we need a bigger vehicle to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Who was Troy Triplett? This is what is known of Troy Triplett. Troy was born November 6, 1914, in Letcher County, Kentucky, to Henry Jack Triplett and Ona Gibson Triplett. His siblings were Jack Triplett, Carl Eugene Triplett Sr., and Virginia Pearl Triplett Brock. He died on May 20th, 1938, at the age of 23 years old. But why did he die so soon? And why was he called the bad man of Letcher County? Triplett accused of Mose Webb's murder. We begin our story with the murder of a mountain farmer named Mose Webb from Macon, Kentucky. The murder took place on December 20th, 1933. Webb was only 55 years old at the time of his passing. The first article that was posted about the death of Mose Webb was published by the Mountain Eagle on Thursday, October 11th, 1934, and it reads, quote, a Letcher County Circuit Court jury was again unable to reach a verdict this week in the case of Troy Triplett, 19, tried Monday for the second time on a charge of murdering Mose Webb at his home on the head of North Fork in December 1933. Webb was near the front porch of his home just after dark when he was wounded in the leg by a shotgun fired by someone standing near his gate. Marilyn Bates was charged with the fatal shooting just after the incident, and police say Triplett was with him. Defense attorneys say Triplett was 5 or 6 miles away from Webb's home at the time of the shooting. A third trial will be held in January. Unquote. We do have some more details as to the Mose Webb case from the newspaper article printed in the Mountain Eagle on May 23, 1938. Quote, in that case, Triplett, then 17, was accused of murdering Mose Webb outside Webb's home at the head of North Fork near Pine Gap in late December 1933. According to testimony in the case, Webb was walking by the front porch of his home when he was shot in the leg with a shotgun. Webb's neighbor, Marilyn Bates, was arrested along with Triplett. Bates was tried separately and was convicted and sentenced to life, while prosecutors claimed Triplett fired the shot that killed Webb. Defense attorneys maintained Triplett was not with Bates when the shot was fired, but was 6 miles away. Jurors were unable to reach a verdict in the case after 2 trials, and Triplett was set free. Unquote. So, first question. How can someone die from a shotgun wound to the leg? In most cases, a person has a greater than a 90% chance of survival if shot in the leg. The only thing we could think of in this case is if the bullet shattered the femoral artery and there was no one around to help apply pressure or a tourniquet to stop the bleeding. It would not take long in such a case for a person to simply bleed out and cause their death. It is estimated that this would have taken anywhere from 5 minutes to 1 hour, depending on how much damage was done to the area. Yes, we know the things we look up for this channel. Anyway, so we can assume that both cases ended with a hung jury because we do not have the proclamation that Triplett was found innocent of the crime. If, on the first trial, he was found innocent, then under the double jeopardy laws, he could not have been tried again. We also do not have a motive as to why Mose Webb was shot. However, because of the trouble that Triplett faced, he was determined to get even with the prosecution's star witness, Dolph Hall. After all, we can assume that Hall placed Triplett at the scene of the crime instead of miles away, as Triplett had claimed. Triplett accused of Dolph Hall's murder. Now, this really depends on which source you use as to how old Dolph Hall was at the time of his death. His age ranges wildly from 10 to 26 years old. Also, the date of his death ranges. Most sources state that it happened sometime during July 15th, 16th, and 17th, 1937. What is actually known is that he was buried in the Potter Cemetery in Kona, Kentucky. His birth is unknown and his family is unknown. We also have no explanation as to what he witnessed during the murder of Mose Webb, or the reason that Troy Triplett would target a child other than Hall placed Triplett at the scene of the crime, and or Hall also testified that he saw Triplett shoot Webb. A little newspaper housekeeping here. At the time in Letcher County, if you were not married and or orphaned and under the age of 18, you were considered to be a child. In many cases, the word infant is used for children under the age of 16 in the newspaper reports. If Dolph Hall was older than Troy Triplett, we have to wonder why Hall is referred to as a child if he was 26 years old, as the newspapers state that he was. But we find it more likely that Hall was somewhere between the ages of 14 to 16 years old at the time of his passing. We do find it odd that there is no mention of who Dolph Hall was, where he lived, who his family was, and his exact age at the time of his death. However, this murder did stir up Letcher County at that time. We are hopeful that more information about who he was will come to light with time. The shooting of Hall. As we have previously stated, Triplett targeted Hall for being a witness for the prosecution in the Webb case. According to the May 23, 1938 Mountain Eagle, we have the following report. Quote, Triplett murdered Hall by shooting him 3 or 4 times after Triplett encountered Hall and another man, J. H. Addington, as they were walking down the North Fork of the Kentucky River after an afternoon of picking huckleberries. Quote, along the way, Triplett said that he was going to fix Hall and perhaps Addington, and all at once he jerked his pistol and shot 3 times at Addington, unquote. The Eagle reported it in July 22, 1937 edition. Quote, but for a mule on which another friend of Hall and Addington named Aikman was riding, he would have killed Addington as the mule was in between them. Triplett then turned and shot the Hall boy 3 or 4 times. By this time, the Aikman boy and Addington had gotten away. Triplett then shot some 5 or 6 times and turned and went back up the road, telling people that he had killed Hall and Addington's mule. Another man at the scene of the shooting, Homer Rose, was charged with providing the pistol Triplett used. Rose was later convicted of willful murder in the case and sentenced to life in prison, unquote. This recorded testimony will be a point of contention in the Court of Appeals case for Triplett, but it gives us a huge glimpse as to what the events were that happened on the day of Hall's death. It seems that Triplett was waiting on the perfect opportunity to kill Hall. Even though there would be a witness that Triplett would also have to kill, it did not seem to matter to Triplett. Hall was his main target, and anyone else would be collateral damage. Triplett's arrest, escape, capture, and trial. Shortly after the death of Hall, Triplett was arrested and taken to Harlan County Jail. The death of Hall had stirred up a lot of hatred towards Triplett, and the authorities feared a mob justice might be placed against him before he went to trial. But evidently, Triplett had no fear about this whatsoever, as it did not take him long to escape from the Harlan County Jail to roam the woods of Letcher County. He was recaptured and brought before the Letcher County Court for trial. This escape is recorded in the May 23, 1938 Mountain Eagle, as we have the following report. Quote, Triplett's trial took place in Whitesburg only 1 week after he was captured, after escaping from the Harlan County Jail, where he had been taken for safekeeping and eluding arrest for a number of days, quote, by roaming the woods of Letcher County, unquote, the Eagle's report said, unquote. According to the Thursday, October 28, 1937 Mountain Eagle, quote, a Letcher County man accused of murdering Dolphy Hall near the head of the Kentucky River in July was tried and convicted and sentenced to death in the record time Tuesday. Until last week, the condemned man, Troy Triplett, was also an escapee from the Harlan County Jail, where he had been taken for his own safekeeping. After his capture and return to the Letcher County Jail last week, Triplett decided to plead guilty, after which an attorney was appointed to represent him. After the plea, the prosecution insisted on introducing proof, and a special jury of 12 men was brought into the county to hear the evidence. The jury deliberated the evidence for only 2 minutes before reaching its finding and sentencing Triplett to death. Hall and 2 friends had been out picking huckleberries when they came upon Triplett and home arose. At some point, Triplett began shouting insults at Hall, who had testified against Triplett a year ago when Triplett was tried for the murder of Moses Webb. Rose apparently stopped along the road, but Triplett kept following Hall, and the other 2 men pulled a pistol from his pocket and shot at all 3 of them, wounding only Hall. Triplett becomes only the second man in the history of Letcher County to be sentenced to death. The first was Floyd Frazier, who was hanged on what is now School Hill in Whitesburg in 1910. Triplett was taken by the sheriff's deputy to the state penitentiary at Eddyville to await execution. Unquote. Now, here is the interesting part of all of this. Before this trial, there were 2 things a defendant in a murder case could do. 1, he could plead guilty and was often given a life sentence, which according to the new Kentucky laws would only be about 10 years if the prisoner had good behavior behind bars. Or 2, he could plead innocent and if found guilty would face the death penalty. However, we shall see this did not work in Triplett's favor. When Triplett went to trial, he immediately pleaded guilty to the charge of murder. The evidence that was put before the jury was for the decision of life in prison or the death penalty. After all of the witnesses and evidence was given, it only took 2 minutes for the jury to come back with a verdict of death. We are pretty sure that Triplett was stunned by this turn of events. He would go on to challenge this verdict with a higher court. Troy Triplett pleads for life. While the trials for the murders of Mose Webb and Dolph Hall is not on public record, we do have the case that was taken to the Kentucky Appellate Court. Most of the evidence of the jury case will be explained during the Kentucky Appellate Court case named Triplett v. Commonwealth, which the final decision was handed down on January 18, 1938. Appearing for the appellant, or Troy Triplett, was John D.W. Collins. Appearing for the appellee, or the Commonwealth of Kentucky, were Hubert Meredith, Attorney General, and W. Owen Keller, Assistant Attorney General. The opinion of the court was given by Judge William H. Rees. According to the court documents, these are the charges levied against Troy Triplett. Quote, appellant shot and killed Dolph Hall in Letcher County, July 16, 1937. Hall was 13 years of age. When the appellate was arraigned, he entered a plea of not guilty. But when the case was called for trial, he withdrew this plea and entered a plea of guilty to the indictment, charging him with the crime of murder, thus leaving the jury only the duty of fixing his punishment at life imprisonment or death. The Commonwealth, as it had a right to do, introduced evidence showing the circumstances attending the killing in order to enable the jury to fix the punishment intelligently. Unquote. The judgment of the admitted crime of murder led to Troy Triplett being sentenced to the death penalty. Triplett sought the reversal of these grounds, stating two reasons. One, that the punishment of death was excessive to the crime, and two, that the court allowed the prosecution in the case to admit evidence after they had closed their case and after the defendant had testified. The defendant felt that the sentence should have stood on the evidence that had been tried alone. The testimony of John Henry Addington. We usually break apart testimonies in these cases. However, we felt that the testimonies of John Henry Addington and Paul Aikman should stand on their own merit. It will be read exactly as entered into the court document, and each should be viewed as one quote. Quote, John Henry Addington, the first witness introduced by the Commonwealth, testified that on the day of the homicide, he, Dolphy Hall, and Paul Aikman crossed the mountain to pick huckleberries, but found that the berries were not ripe, and returned to the foot of the mountain, where they were joined by Troy Triplett, Homer Rose, and Harrison Spurgeon. Triplett was angry because the Hall boy had testified against him in some court proceeding, and, in the presence of the witness, said in substance that he was going to kill Hall. Triplett, Hall, and the others walked down the road to a point where the path led across the hill. Hall, Addington, and Aikman turned into the path, and Triplett ran up to them and said, quote, You're going down the road, unquote. They turned and accompanied Triplett and Rose to Brack Quillen's home, where Addington and Aikman turned and started back. Triplett again ran up to them and said, quote, You're going with us, unquote. They continued down the road to the mouth of Webb Branch, and then to the home of Arlie Vanover. Addington told Triplett he wanted a drink of water, and Triplett said that he would go into the house and get it. While he was absent, Dolphy Hall walked into the house, but Triplett took a hold of his arm and led him back to the road. When Triplett gave the water to Addington, he said, quote, Take a good cold drink. That is all you will need until you get one in hell, unquote. They continued down the road, appellant complaining all the while because Dolphy Hall had testified against him. He threatened several times to kill the Hall boy. Addington testified as follows concerning what Triplett said and did when they reached the place where the killing took place. Quote, he said, quote, Damn him, I'm going to bump him off, unquote. And I begged him up there before we started not to bother him, not to hurt him. And we come on down there a little farther, and he said that he didn't aim to leave no evidence. And I says to him, quote, You wouldn't hurt that little harmless boy, would you, unquote. He said, quote, How old are you, son? And I said, quote, I'm 13, unquote. And he turned around to me and said, quote, I was in the pen by the time I was as big as he is, unquote. And he said, quote, I don't aim to leave any evidence, him, nor none of you, unquote. We got on down to the mouth of the branch, and he kindly showed Dolphy how to sit down. There was a little bank there, just a small bank, and Dolphy sat down and placed his face down in his hands, and he says, quote, Let's talk some, unquote. Troy did, and just as he said that, he commenced backing backwards and pulling his gun, and I commenced backing away up the road. I backed up the road. I backed up 2 or 3 steps while he was that way. That throwed us some little distance apart. Well, quote, the court. Who was it that drew the gun and backed up? Answer, Triplett. Troy Triplett. Then he drew his gun and shot the way the little boy was riding the mule. The first shot and the mule then wheeled and made a circle around. It hit the mule, and as she came around, she knocked me over against the plank fence kindly, about 6 feet, and he shot one more shot in the ground under me as I fell, or about the time I fell. And then he went right back by the back of Doffy Hall and shot into him 3 shots in his side, next to him in the right side. And then by that time I got up, there where the fence was, and took up through on my hands and feet, where I hurt my leg, and he was shot. About the time he loaded his gun up, he was working the gun about the time I started, and then he was shot. There, around about the same place, 6 more shots. Troy told him to sit down and motioned to him, and then he sat down on the little bank. And when he sat down, he put his hands down that way, and his head was something like this, and saying something. I don't know what it was, and he never did raise up no more that I seen of, unquote. The testimonies of Paul Aikman and Jesse Holbrook. Paul Aikman, a boy of 13 years of age, testified to substantially the same facts, except he did not see the whole transaction, as he ran when the first shot was fired. The only other witness introduced by the Commonwealth was Jesse Holbrook. He reached the scene of the killing about 30 minutes after it occurred and found the mule laying in the road and Dolphy Hall on the bank by the side of the road, dead. Holbrook described the conditions he found as follows. Quote, the embankment was about that high above the road, indicating, and looked as if he had hunkered down just like this, about in that position, indicating. And he was shot through the head and through into the arm. The arm was still under his head, and there was 5 more shots down his back, as if he was shot right down that way, unquote. Both of the testimonies of Holbrook and Aikman seemed to match the testimony of Addington. Aikman was at the scene when the crime began, and Holbrook came up on the scene after the dust had cleared. Would their testimonies be allowed to stand, or will the court decide to throw them out as evidence not essential to the case? Troy Triplett's attorney, John W. Collins, presented the evidence concerning the 2 reasons as to why the court should render a favorable verdict for Troy Triplett. Would the appellate court agree with the reasons as to why the verdict should be overturned? Or would the appellate court agree with the verdict rendered by a jury in the Letcher County Court? The evidence for the first reason. We don't actually get a direct testimony from Troy Triplett in the document. Mainly, we are told that Triplett testified on his own behalf, even though he had pled guilty. This plea was never withdrawn. In his version of events, Triplett explains that this was indeed not an act of murder, but one of self-defense. He claimed that Dolph Hall attacked him with a knife, cutting twice into his shoulder. Triplett claims that he had to defend himself by shooting Hall. He also states that he had been drinking intoxicating liquor on that day. There is a problem with this, as Triplett had never used the being drunk defense before this moment. And during direct examination, Triplett, quote, related conversations that took place just before the shooting and described the actions of various parties present in minute detail, indicating that he was then in full possession of all his faculties. On cross-examination, he was asked if he had been drinking, and his answer was that he had a drink or two. This negated his defense of being too drunk to control his actions. He had to show that he was intoxicated to the point that his mental capabilities of reasoning were severely impaired. The court ruled that Triplett was unable to prove that he was too drunk to know what he was doing. Quote, the evidence in the present case utterly fails to show intoxication of such degree as to warrant mitigation of punishment. On the contrary, it shows that the appellant was in full possession of his reasoning faculties when the crime was committed, and that the murder was a ruthless one, committed with premeditation and deliberation. The fact that the jury fixed the appellate's punishment at death rather than life imprisonment does not authorize an interference of passion or prejudice on their part, unquote. All of this is pretty straightforward. The court ruled that there was really no evidence stating that this verdict should be overturned because of the fact that the appellate claims that he was drunk at the time of the crime. That even if he had been drinking, he was able to remember the minute details of what happened. So, the first petition for the reversal of the judgment was denied. The evidence for the second reason. The second part of the petition for reversal of the death penalty had to do with the 6 rebuttal witnesses. In the petition, the appellant argues that their testimony was substantial evidence and should not have been used as a rebuttal. That after the plea of guilty, their evidence should not have been allowed. The appellant gives the following evidence about their testimonies. Quote, the appellant had testified that he had heard John Henry Addington make a certain statement to Doffy Hall just before the killing. Addington was introduced in rebuttal and denied making the statement. His testimony on this point was purely rebutting and admissible. Furthermore, no objection to the question or answer was made. Addington was then asked if the appellant's testimony that the deceased walked around the mule and gave the appellant some liquor just before the shooting was true, and he answered, quote, no, sir. He drove Doffy Hall down the road like driving a hog and made him sit down there and went to shooting at us, unquote. The appellant objected to the answer, and the court said, quote, just answer the question, unquote. The answer was not wholly responsive to the question and was not excluded from the jury, but no exception was taken. Paul Aikman and Jesse Hobart testified in rebuttal, but their testimony was not material. Sarah Vanover and her brother, Arlie Vanover, lived near the scene of the tragedy. They testified that the appellant came to their home just after the shooting. He was in his shirt sleeves, was wearing a white shirt, and there was no blood on it as claimed by him in his testimony. He remained in their house about 5 minutes, but did not tell them he had been cut with a knife. W. H. Cottle, sheriff of Letcher County, examined Doffy Hall's body shortly after he was shot, and he testified that the bullets entered his back. Appellant had testified that Hall was facing him when the shots were fired. The testimony of all these witnesses was purely rebutting, and it follows that the appellant's second contention is wholly without merit, unquote. So, why would they be rebuttal witnesses? Because of the statements given by Triplett during his testimony. In other words, he was not being completely honest in his statements. The court allowed the jury to hear these witnesses to make up their own minds whether or not the sentence of life or death should be imposed. And the upper court agreed with this decision to allow the statements to be entered into the record. The final decision and sentence carried out. The appellate court ruled that it was up to the jury to determine the sentence in this case. Because Triplett had pled guilty to the charges, and all of the evidence was laid before them, they had one of two choices. Either they were going to sentence Triplett to life or death. There simply were no other options. And it stood correct that the jury came to its own conclusions that the sentence of death was appropriate in this particular case. The appellate court felt that because everything was indeed in order, they had no reason to disturb the jury verdict. According to the Washington Times, we have this simple report. Quote, Kentucky bad man to die. Whitesburg, Kentucky, October 29th, INS. Troy Triplett, 32, locally feared bad man of the mountains, today was doomed to die for the slaying of Doff Hall, 26, at Kona Station last July, unquote. We found the following newspaper article on the Find a Grave website of Troy Triplett. There was no newspaper attribute concerning the article, so for now it will remain unknown. Quote, Troy Triplett, buried on Billmore Branch Monday. The body of Troy Triplett, who was electrocuted at Eddyville on May 20th at 12:24 a.m., was returned to Whitesburg for burial. He was sentenced to death at the last October term of the Letcher Circuit Court for the murder of Dolphy Hall on the North Fork of Kentucky River last fall. Funeral services were held on Billmore Branch on the North Fork of the Kentucky River. Monday, May 23rd at 3:30, with burial in the family cemetery. Burke and Kraft Funeral Home had charge of the funeral arrangements, unquote. According to the same Find a Grave website, Troy Triplett is now buried at the Pauley Cemetery in Ermine, Letcher County, Kentucky. Thank you. Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the story of Troy Triplett, the bad man of Letcher County. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification buttons. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.